Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us. On the program today, the man that many call the guardian of evolution in America. He's known as an expert on evolution, intelligent design, and creationism. Dr. Kenneth Miller, a Brown University professor of biology and best-selling author, is in Bowling Green as a guest of the WKU Cultural Enhancement Series. Now, whatever your beliefs, I want you to stay tuned because I think it's going to be interesting. It'll be a lively discussion indeed. It's been 80 years since the Scopes monkey trial, and yet we are still having this, if you want to call it, civil war over evolution in America. Now, you are a practicing Roman Catholic. You're not an atheist.
I always tell people I'm going to keep practicing until I get it right. That's
well,
correct.
I think we all should keep practicing until we get it right. But basically, you believe that religion and evolution can coexist.
Absolutely.
Explain that.
Well, I'm often asked by people, how do you reconcile evolution and religion? And my answer always is, if two ideas are not fundamentally in conflict, they don't have to be reconciled. And the reason I say that is really very simple. What evolution tells us is that we are creatures of this world. We are natural creatures, and that our existence was brought about by exactly the same natural process that operated everywhere else on this planet. So in a way, the view of living things and the view of this planet that someone gains through evolution, I think, is a grander and a more expansive view of life and of our natural history than any person can possibly have who thinks that some sort of a designer god had to tinker with living things and create them sort of like a workman in a shop, one thing at a time. My idea of God, and I often say that I think a religious person who accepts evolution has a higher opinion of God than someone who is a creationist, because they think he's a little tinkerer, has to do things one at a time. Our view is this is a fellow who is so clever that he set a process in motion that gave rise to every living thing on this planet, including you and me and all of your viewers and listeners.
An interesting concept. You also believe that this national debate is a good thing because it's got people talking about science. It's got them debating science.
Well, I think that we live in a century that is going to be dominated not just by science, but by the biological sciences in particular. And America in the past, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, established itself as the greatest scientific country in the world. And you can look at that by any standard, by our discoveries, by our inventions, by the fact that we went to the moon. We're the people basically who sequenced the genome, who understand how life actually works. And what's going to happen in this century is that an appreciation of the sciences, especially life science, is going to be more important than ever before. So the interest that people have in evolution, I think, is a way of merging our natural interest in who are we and what do our lives mean and where do we come from with what is life really like. And that's at the heart of the curiosity that drives biology.
Okay, but why are you saying this century? What is it about this century? Because we know so much more, because we're having more debates, because we have
Well, no, what's happened in the last 20 years is that biology has changed from what you might call fundamentally a descriptive science. When I was in high school, being a biologist meant that you knew how to classify plants and animals, that you could go out in the woods and pick up an acorn or a leaf and you could say where it was from. You could pick up a flower, you could understand the life cycle of a flower and so forth. What biology means now, of course, is all of that. But more importantly, biology has now become a productive science. It's a science that you can do things with. Not only develop medicines, produce vaccines, cure disorders, but also we're at a point where we can actually construct living organisms. An awful lot of what we eat every day, an awful lot of what you see in the supermarket are in fact genetically modified foods. And that's really just the beginning, because biologists today are now talking about making synthetic organisms. Organisms, microbes in particular, that would be constructed in such a way that they could actually help to solve some of our problems with pollution, with waste disposal, and even energy generation. And the nation that most embraces the sort of new sciences of biology, genomics, and biotechnology, that's the nation that's going to lead the world at the end of the 21st century. And I certainly hope that's the United States.
So these genetically altered foods and whatnot, or genetically enhanced foods in some cases,
Sure.
You think that's a good thing?
Well, the opinion is divided about that. And I certainly wouldn't want to say that I speak for all biologists, because there are a lot of concerns about genetic modification. Genetic modification is a powerful technology, and all powerful technologies can yield great benefits, but they also have inherent dangers. But I often tell my students that I'm a big fan of genetically modified foods. I wish they were labeled. So when I went into the supermarket over here, I'd see flour or corn grown from genetically modified plants, and if it was labeled, I'd pay a dime or 15 cents extra for it. And the reason for that is when I buy a product, for example, that's made from genetically modified corn, I know a couple of things. The first thing is, I know that food material is not going to have any organophosphate pesticide residue in it. And the reason for that is genetically modified corn has a gene built into it that prevents insects from attacking that plant. So the farmer's not going to waste any money on chemical insecticides. So that's point number one. Point number two, I also know it's more friendly to the environment, because the yield of these genetically modified varieties is greater. So less acreage is required and less pollution and less degradation of the soil for the same amount of food. Those are the reasons why I'm in favor of this sort of thing, but I agree, you have to be careful.
You got that one? Now we're going to be tested on that one later.
The quiz is coming
The
later.
quiz
You got
is
that
coming
right,
up.
Barbara.
But let's get back to the evolution
Sure.
discussion, because that's what you know so well. And you believe that they can coexist, but more importantly, you have been quoted as saying you believe it because it matters. It's important.
Indeed.
And one of your books, and we're going to talk more about the second of your two books that you have here today, Evolution, The Battle for America's Soul. Are we losing our soul? What's happening?
Well, I think we're at a tipping point right now in the United States. And you saw a lot of arguments really revolving around science come up actually during the last election. We're at a point right now where an enormous number of critical public policy questions revolve around science, more so than ever before. And these questions include health-related issues, global warming, the search for new sources of energy, how we should fund or not fund research on human embryos, stem cells, a whole variety of areas of medical research. And I think what matters right now is whether the United States is going to continue to be the most science-friendly country in the world. And I think that's been the key to our technological and our material success in the last half century, or whether we're going to, for ideological reasons or for religious reasons, turn our back on science. And what I tell my fellow Christians is very simple, and that is that the first duty of any Christian is a duty to the truth. So what matters, and this deals specifically with the question of evolution, what matters is whether or not the empirical evidence is there, whether or not evolution is true. You don't go at it with a preconception that your religious viewpoint requires you to find certain things out or not to find certain things out about nature, because if you do that, you're not going to be doing science very well. And I think it's very much in the Western tradition to regard faith and reason both as gifts from God. And if faith and reason are both gifts from God, we have to respect both of them. And that means respecting science, which is, of course, the child of reason.
You sound like a philosopher, and often Darwin is called a philosopher, but he wasn't a philosopher.
I'm not a philosopher. I'm just an ordinary cell biologist who works in the laboratory with his electron microscope. I teach my students. I enjoy teaching enormously. I enjoy writing. And what I've tried to do, and all teachers try to do this, is sort of bring the joys of scientific discovery to my students, and more recently to the people who are able to read my books.
You bring up a really valid point that science is going to play an even greater role in everything, in every decision that is made as we proceed in this life. And so, would you like to have seen a scientist in the White House? You anticipate a day when it's going to be a scientist there?
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I do want to see somebody in the White House who respects science and who realizes that science is where the future of the country lies, and science is also where the solution to quite a few of our problems lie. And I think in the past we've had very enlightened administrations. And I'll give you an example of one of those enlightened administrations. I'm one of the people in a generation of scientists that benefited from something. And I'm going to tell you what we benefited from. Sputnik. In 1957, Russia, the Soviet Union, gained a leg up in the space race by being the first country, and then the second country, to orbit an Earth satellite. And the technological shock that went through the American scientific and technical community was enormous. And what happened, first under the Eisenhower administration, and later under the Kennedy administration, was an enormous infusion of resources, creativity, and yes, money into science education. Now, I was in middle school and high school at the time, and I was the beneficiary of this. We had new programs for science and math education in the schools. We produced a rising tide of people in the technical specialties who went on to basically invent the personal computer and lead the computer revolution. I went to graduate school at the University of Colorado under the National Defense Education Act Fellowship Program. My graduate education in molecular biology was basically funded by the Defense Department because the government realized it was important for national security to have scientifically trained people. In a way, I wish right now that we could have as great a shock to our systems, and maybe what's happening in the country right now is that great a shock, as Sputnik going up. And I think we have to realize that we have competitors in the world, friendly competitors, but competitors nonetheless. And we have to be on our guard, not to put them down, but we have to be on our guard to have the best possible science education for our young people to build the next generation.
Well, who is our greatest competition out there when it comes to that, the one-up, if you will?
The world is filled with technologically advanced countries who want to emulate the American model of science.
You know, what used to be like what you referenced the Sputnik. I mean, when the superpowers were there, it was
Right.
always Russia. We could always point to Russia.
Oh, Russia was always the
But
bad guys.
now you're saying basically it's a plethora.
Well, let's take a couple of examples. Let's take the human genome, genetics, and molecular biology. The Europeans, for years, France, Germany, Spain, even Great Britain, have looked with great envy at the research establishment we've built up in molecular biology in the United States. So a decade and a half ago, they established in Heidelberg, Germany, something called the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. And their stated goal was to produce an American-style climate for doing science, meaning no hierarchy, easy access to ideas, a system in which young people with good creative ideas could get ahead very quickly. To some extent, they've succeeded, so that European science is not quite our equal in genomics research, but they certainly emulate that. Countries in Southeast Asia, and I think specifically of Singapore, South Korea, and also Japan, have recognized that there's an enormous amount to be learned from studying molecular development and stem cell biology in particular. So some of the most important advances in the last couple of years in stem cell biology have come from Singapore, South Korea, and Japan. They rival what we do in the United States. So these countries have seen the light as well. And if the United States sets down the mantle of scientific leadership in the life sciences in the world, the other countries will be all too happy to pick it up, and I don't think we'll get it back. And I don't think that'd be a good thing for this country.
I don't think that'd be a good thing for this country, but to say that there's one particular country out there that is our greatest rival, if you will, it just...
No, I certainly wouldn't pick anybody. Basically, the scientific world has looked at what's happened in the United States in the last half century and have said, you know what, we want to replicate that here. So you find countries following the American model.
We're following, and yet I think you would be quick to say we haven't lived up to our potential, if you will.
Of course not.
Okay, and funding? What's the problem? What happened? You know, we were up there, yes.
Well, first of all, look, I'm a scientist and I compete for research grants like anybody else. I'd always like to have more, but I'm also a taxpayer, so I know very well where those research funds come from.
And we're going to talk more about that. We have to take a short break. Where those research funds come from, what happened, and we've got 2 books of Dr. Miller's to talk about when we come back right after this. Don't go away. Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Kenneth Miller, who happens to be in town as part of the WKU Cultural Enhancement Series. He is the author of the book, several books actually, lots of textbooks, Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. He tells me it's in its 28th printing, which, congratulations,
Thank you very much.
That really is huge. And so we're talking a little bit before the break about God and evolution coexisting. You are a scientist. You are a professor of biology.
Correct.
You teach at Brown University. But yet you're a Christian. You are a Catholic, a Roman Catholic. You're not an atheist, as one, might automatically jump to that conclusion, but you do believe that God and evolution, the theory of evolution, can coexist. Let's talk a little bit about Darwin's theory. He is the one who is most often referenced when it comes to the theory of evolution.
Sure.
We hear Darwin's name. Is that a theory in crisis? Is it in trouble?
Oh, not even close. Darwin published his broad outline of his ideas in The Origin of Species, which was published just about 150 years ago. I think it's fair to say that no scientific theory in history has ever had as many pot shots taken at it, had as many people trying as hard as they possibly could to disprove it as the theory of evolution. And 150 years later, it's still standing. Now, that's a remarkable testament to the genius of this idea. And here's what's even more impressive about evolution. Darwin didn't know anything about genetics.
Right.
Genetics really hadn't been discovered.
No.
He didn't know anything about biochemistry. He couldn't even have suspected molecular biology. And he also didn't know anything about radioactivity, because radioactivity wouldn't be discovered for another 45 years. Any one of these new scientific fields in emergence could have basically destroyed the whole idea of evolution. Radiometric dating, for example, of rocks and minerals, held out the prospect to show, if it were true, that the Earth was young, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 years old. And if that had been shown, then Darwin's theory would have simply been discarded. He realized that himself. And instead, when radioactivity was discovered and geologists began to apply these tools to investigate the age of the Earth, they discovered not only the Earth wasn't young, but it was probably an order of magnitude older than Darwin had suspected it was. So there was plenty of time for his theory. If there was not a mechanism to transmit favorable variations unchanged from one generation to another, his theory would have broken down as well. And he worried about that. Well, that mechanism is what today we call genetics. And then finally, if all organisms do show a pathway, a sort of a relationship of common descent from common ancestors, we ought to see that written into the bases of their DNA. We ought to see that in the genetic code. So we can actually conduct very rigorous tests at the molecular level of the broad and the specific outlines of evolutionary theory. And guess what? Living organisms pass those tests one after another after another. And I'll talk about some of these in my lecture tonight. So the most extraordinary thing about the theory of evolution is here it is, 150 years later, adding to our knowledge from all fields of science. And the notion that so many lines of evidence have converged on this one idea shows that this is a very powerful, hardworking, and practical scientific theory.
So Darwin's theory, not in crisis, but what about this movement or theory, I don't know how you want to label it, I'm sure you have a label for it, called intelligent design. What are we talking about there?
Well, if I had to give a prize for the best public relations move that the anti-evolution movement has made in 150 years, I'd give it to the people who cooked up the label intelligent design for this specific body of knowledge, body of argument. And here's the reason. I think if you're a theist of any sort, if you're a person who believes in a God or a spiritual dimension to the world and so forth, then I think by definition, you think that there is an intelligent design to things. You think there's a logic behind the natural world. Now, for what it's worth, that's something I actually believe myself. But what intelligent design actually teaches is that the complex parts we see in living organisms, organisms themselves, and major evolutionary novelties in the fossil record were designed. Now, what they mean by designed is they mean they were created. They mean that a force acting outside of nature, which is to say a supernatural force, brought them into existence. And what this allows you to do is to look at the record of natural history. And every time you see a new organism appearing, and we see that all the time, it means the designer created this, created that, created something else. Now, is that possible? Sure. But what it leads you to do is to sort of question the competence of this designer. And the reason I say that is because if he's creating all these things, why have 99.9% of all the organisms he's ever created gone extinct? Is this a guy who just can't get it right? Well, the answer is of course not. What you're actually looking at is a process of evolution by natural selection. You're not looking at special creation.
Natural selection and mutation? What role mutation in
Well,
all of this?
a mutation is an inheritable change in the genetics, in the DNA sequence of an organism. And mutations happen all the time. People usually think of point mutations, like a single base in DNA changes here or there. But the genetic material is a lot more flexible than that. From generation to generation, genes can move around. Fragments of one chromosome can break off and be stuck on another portion of the chromosome. Genetic recombination, every time we produce a new generation, our genes get mixed together and swapped. My wife and I have two lovely daughters. They've got a little bit of dad's genes, and they got a little bit of mom's, and they each have a unique combination. All of these produce variation in every single species, and it's variation that natural selection acts upon. It's also variation that gives species the chance to cope with changes in the environment. It's the reason we're still here. It's the reason life is successful.
Kind of evolving.
You got it.
We want to talk about intelligent design a little bit more because it serves as part of the second book, Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. You were called in to testify in Dover, Pennsylvania. There was an issue there. The school board wanted to mandate that teachers would be required to teach not only evolution but also intelligent design. So it became a huge court case. And you were there to testify, and the New Yorker followed it, the New Yorker magazine, and they really credit you with the judge's decision to mandate that teachers did not have to teach both in the classroom. So give us a little background on that.
Well, first of all, it was very kind of Margaret Talbert for the New Yorker to say that. But the reality of the case is a little more subtle, and that is the school board in Dover instructed the biology teachers in Dover to prepare a curriculum on this thing called intelligent design. And the biology teachers in Dover, there's only 3 of them, it's a really small town, at the risk of losing their jobs, at the risk of being fired, they said, no, we won't teach this stuff. This is not science. So the school board then decided to write their own intelligent design lesson. And then they asked the teachers, would you at least read this to the kids? And once again, at the risk of being fired, the teachers refused. So the school board was reduced to sending the superintendent and the assistant superintendent into the classroom to read the intelligent design lesson while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway.
But what motivated this? Why was the school board so gung-ho intelligent design?
To put it simply, they were put up to it. There is an organization based in Seattle, Washington called the Discovery Institute. And they have put out books and pamphlets and videos arguing that intelligent design should be taught in the science classroom in public schools. And members of the Discovery Institute basically acted to persuade members of the Dover board that they ought to be the first school district in the country to try this, that they'd back them up. And they literally gave them a playbook. There actually is a booklet called Intelligent Design of the Public School Science Curricula. And they followed this playbook, so they were put up to it by this national
but I gotta
organization.
ask you this. You're an educator. Wouldn't you want to throw it all out there and, put it in context and say, maybe we don't think this is science, but this is what's out there, children. You draw your own conclusions.
Well, I think openness in education is a very good idea. But what I don't believe as a scientist is that you should take ideas that have been completely rejected by the scientific community, and then in front of impressionable 13, 14, and 50-year-olds pretend that these ideas have equal standing. It would be a lot like saying in health class, we're going to talk about faith healing. We're going to talk about witchcraft. We're going to talk about traditional remedies that have been shown to have no basis in science. And I think science class should be devoted to science. I know that's a radical idea for a lot of people, but I think it's how you construct science education. So what happened the day after these lessons were read is that 11 parents filed a lawsuit arguing that intelligent design was mostly a religious idea. And since an agent of government, school board, had done this, their First Amendment rights as Americans had been violated. A 7-week trial ensued in federal court, and I was called as the lead witness for the plaintiffs in that trial, and I set out to define what was science, what wasn't science, why evolution has stood this test of time, what the arguments were that were posed by intelligent design, and one by one, I tried to explain to the court why those arguments fell apart.
And they did, indeed. And so, bottom line, in Dover, Pennsylvania, they're not teaching intelligent design.
They certainly aren't, and this is a federal court decision. The case is called Kenneth Miller versus Dover, and it was a ringing indictment of intelligent design. Any notion that intelligent design was a coherent scientific theory just fell apart in the courtroom, and you could see their witnesses collapsing, contradicting each other, the scientific case falling apart, and everyone realized this was exactly what was happening. And it was important Nova, the public television series, did a 2-hour show on this last year called Judgment Day. It was all about the intelligent design trial. It won a Peabody Award for excellence in broadcast journalism. It was extraordinary viewing, and I think it was a record of what this idea is and how thoroughly this idea has failed.
We could talk for hours and hours. We're just about out of time, so leave us with some words of wisdom. It's an exciting time to be a part of science.
I don't think there is any time that I can think of in human history that's as exciting for a scientist to be as alive as right now. And I think the most important thing that we can give the young people in this country is to give them a first-rate 21st century science education. And that means leaving aside all of the old religious battles and arguments that go back to the 19th and even to the 20th century, and moving ahead with what we know about in science. And I think properly construed, science and scientific education isn't a threat to religion. It's part of that lockstep of faith and reason that underlies religious belief, but also underlies our faith, that in understanding nature and knowing the world better, we're truly doing God's work and we're doing the right thing for our children.
Dr. Kenneth Miller on the program today, the man that many call the guardian of evolution in America, the author of Only a Theory, Evolution in the Battle for America's Soul, and Finding Darwin's God. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us.